Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you are watching this, and this is What's Left. My name is Larry Erickson. I'm the host, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be going on about some things that I hope you'll be interested in. As always, if you have any reactions to the show, you can certainly send them to me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating@aol.com. And if you didn't catch that, you can always go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be here a couple of times during the show. You can get the email address from there if you didn't run out for pen and paper and write it down. Or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather do it that way. As always, though, if you do send me email to requests, include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is about the show, it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer, but you will get one. You will get one. All right, with that, I said at the last show that I hope to come back with some better news, and actually I've got several things of good news today. But the first one is something I have to say I would like to call good news, but I really can't. Timothy Loehmann, the Cleveland cop who murdered 12-year-old Tamir Rice in 2014, the Cleveland cop who got off after a smear campaign against Tamir and his family, and after the prosecutor went before a grand jury and acted more like a defense counsel than a prosecutor, the Cleveland cop who the city eventually admitted should never have been hired in the first place, Timothy Loehmann, that cop, has been fired after an internal departmental investigation. Now, it makes you want to say that at least there's some breath of justice here, but the fact is I can't. Not only because it's too little too late, but because, and this is really what turns my stomach about this, he wasn't fired for anything to do with Tamir Rice. He was fired for, quoting the department, rule violations concerning his application process to be considered a cadet with the Division of Police. In other words, he lied on his job application, which is apparently a bigger crime in the eyes of the Cleveland police than shooting down a 12-year-old. All right, but next up, getting to some actual good news. Consider this one a blow against the empire of fear. The Islamic Society of Basking Ridge, New Jersey, wanted to build a mosque in upscale Bernards Township. The town said no, claiming land use and safety violations and concerns. One of their concerns was parking, because they said Friday afternoon was peak worship time, and where are all those people going to park? Except for the fact that the town had not considered the worship habits and times of those attending churches or synagogues when applications for those constructions were made. Oh, the town said, but zoning laws said that a parcel of land for a house of worship has to be at least 6 acres, which is bigger than the lot the Islamic Society had purchased. Except that that requirement never came up until the proposal for the mosque came around. And 8 of the 11 houses of worship, other houses of worship in the town built before this change, are on less than 6 acres of land. A federal judge did not buy the town's excuses. On December 3rd, ruled in favor of the Islamic Society and the Department of Justice in their suits against the town. The result was that on May 31st, it was determined that Bernards Township must pay the Islamic Society $3.25 million as a result of its wrongful denial of a permit and violation of civil rights. I have said any number of times that bigotry must be made to pay a price. So this then has to be considered good news. Now, next up, I have talked a number of times about the issue of voter ID, or as it's properly called, suppressing the vote of minorities and the poor. Indeed, a recent study concluded that photo ID laws kept over 200,000 mostly Democratic and African American voters from the polls in the 2016 elections in Wisconsin alone. So it was good news that just a few days after that report came out, the Supreme Court shot down once and for all the strict voter identification law that had been passed by the reactionary legislature of North Carolina. The law was struck down by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, saying it, and this is a quote, targets African Americans with almost surgical precision in order to suppress their vote. Now, after Roy Cooper was elected governor of North Carolina, his administration dropped the state's appeal of that decision, but the Gopper-dominated legislature insisted that they had the right to intervene in the case to defend the law. Well, on May 15th, the Supreme Court issued a 2-page decision that boiled down to no, just no. So at least for now, North Carolina's voter suppression has been stopped, and that is indeed good news, as long as you bear in mind that I said for now. There is actually some other good news related to voting rights. In particular, on May 29th, the Illinois legislature unanimously passed a bill to establish automatic voter registration. The bill is now waiting for the signature of Governor Rauner, who vetoed a previous version of the bill, but will have a hard time vetoing this one, not only because of the unanimous passage of the legislation, but because this version was specifically tailored in order to meet his objections to the previous one. That, when it happens, would make Illinois the 9th state, along with the District of Columbia, to have automatic voter registration. And 32 other states have had legislation toward that end introduced this year. All of that good news. Now, actually a bit of double plus good news on the front of LGBTQ rights. A couple of years ago, as a sophomore, Ashton Whitaker, who was a transgender boy, sued his school, the Trimper High School in Kenosha, Wisconsin, for the right to use the boys' restroom. In September, U.S. District Judge Pamela Pepper ruled in his favor, issuing an injunction requiring the school to allow him to use the boys' bathroom while the case continued. The school district appealed that ruling. And on May 31st, the second to last day of Whitaker's senior year, a 3-judge panel of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the appeal and upheld the lower court's decision, the injunction. Writing for the 7th Circuit Court, Judge Ann Claire Williams disputed the school's claim that allowing Whitaker to use the boys' bathroom would somehow harm other students, writing that the school district had, quote, failed to provide any evidence of how the preliminary injunction will harm it or any of its students or any of its parents, and that, quoting again, the harms identified by the school district are all speculative and based on conjecture, whereas the harms to Ash are well documented and supported by the record. Now, this doesn't mean the case is over. What it means is that the lower court's injunction that Whitaker must be allowed to use the boys' restroom is upheld, and it's valid and it's in force. What makes this important, though, the double plus good part, is that while the ruling only applies to Whitaker himself, even if he could take advantage of it for only like 2 days before he graduates, the 7th Circuit Court found that it did because it determined that upon a full review of the case, he is likely to win on his claims that the school violated his rights under Title IX, which is a federal law that bars sex discrimination in schools, and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now consider what that means, as pointed out by German Lopez at Vox.com. If Title IX shields transgender students from discrimination, then it's not just Whitaker's rights that are protected here, it's those of all transgender students. If the 14th Amendment covers transgender people, it's not just Whitaker who's protected, it's potentially all transgender people. This is just hypothetical now. This is absolutely just hypothetical. But depending upon how other circuit courts react to this decision and use this decision when they are faced with their own cases involving transgender rights, the fact is that Whitaker v. Kenosha Unified School District could become the transgender community's Obergefell v. Hodges. This comes at a time of rapid change of attitudes about transgender rights, similar to the rapid change that we saw about same-sex marriage, which now claims the support of 64% of the American public. 10 years ago, it was less than 40%. 20 years ago, it was only 27%. As recently as 2015, according to one poll, Americans were about evenly divided on the question of whether or not transgender people should be able to use the bathroom that accords with their gender identity. A little less than 40% said yes, a little less than 40% said no. But a different poll in March of this year found that 53% of those surveyed oppose laws that require transgender people to use the bathroom that accords with the sex they were assigned at birth rather than their gender identity. The gain in support across those two polls is 15 percentage points in 2 years. Now, I just want to make sure you can't compare these polls exactly. They were done by different outfits, and they were differently phrased questions. But still, the indication of growing support you would draw from that cannot be denied. By the way, that same poll done this year, it was done by a nonpartisan outfit called the Public Religion Research Institute. And they reported in their poll that 70% of Americans support laws protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination in areas such as jobs, public accommodation, and housing. And that support included a majority of Democrats, of independents, and of Republicans. At the same time, never forget the battle's not over. In April, Alabama lawmakers passed a measure that would, in essence, allow private adoption and child placement agencies to discriminate against LGBTQ parents based on a claim of their religious freedom. All right, next up. I think I've made it abundantly clear that I think in the healthcare debate, our focus should be on health care, not health insurance. And so progressives should be looking beyond even single-payer health insurance, popularly now known as Medicare for all, to a national health care system. Be that as it may, single-payer would still be a vast improvement over what we have now, and support for single-payer among the public has actually been growing. It's strong, and it's been growing over the last few years. For example, a poll done by The Economist and YouGov, done in early April of this year, found 60% support for, quote, expanding Medicare to provide health insurance to every American. Even when they rephrased the question as creating a federally funded health insurance system that covered every American, they still got 61% support. When the Morning Consult political poll, also in early April, asked the question, perhaps the most pejorative way possible, referring to a situation where, quote, all Americans would get their health insurance from one government plan, they still got 44% in favor and only 36% against. And while at a national level we seem to be bogged down in arguing over just how bad the GOPR plan is, rather than pushing alternatives, there is some action on the state level on this. For one thing, a single-payer plan in and for California is moving through the legislature. It hit a snag last week when a legislative report said that the program would cost a lot more than initially thought, but legislators are working on a way to finance it. Even more significant is that on May 16th, the New York State Assembly passed a single-payer health care bill that in several ways is even broader than Medicare for all would be, and that it covers some things like dental, which Medicare essentially does not. Now, the Assembly has passed a similar bill before, only to have it die in the Senate, which is dominated by more conservative legislators from the upstate part of New York. But this year could, although I emphasize could, be different, because as of last report, the bill was exactly one vote short of a majority in the state Senate. Meanwhile, New Jersey has become the latest state to see a proposal for a state-level single-payer plan introduced into the legislature. Now, there are attempts at the national level, don't get me wrong. H.R. 676, known as the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All Act, now has 112 co-sponsors, the largest number ever for a single-payer plan. And Bernie Sanders is expected to introduce a comparable, even if not a companion, bill in the Senate. Still, it has to be admitted that the chances of such bills passing the Congress this year are slim at best, if that's not overstating it, which is one reason for pushing beyond that. It's a matter of staking out the territory, of saying this is where we want to go, rather than looking at this is where we think we can get in the short term because it's already popular. Looking beyond the short term is how you win in the long term. On that, let's take a break. And here we are back again. And because that last bit was related to healthcare, I'm using it as an excuse to bring this up just because I want to. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2016, there were 70 cases of measles in the United States, spread across 16 states. But recently, there have been 41 cases of measles in Minnesota. Of those 41 cases, 34 are Somali immigrants. 40 of those cases involve children under 16, most of them children who are unvaccinated. Now, why are the numbers so high and so heavily concentrated in the Somali community? Well, contrary to the bigots, it has nothing to do with the Quran or Muslim beliefs or any of that. In fact, vaccination rates for Somali Minnesotans for the children in 2004 were as high as 92%, which is actually 3 percentage points higher than the state as a whole. But by 2016, the vaccination rate for those children was down to just 42%, making the sort of outbreak we've now seen all but inevitable. What happened in the interim? The anti-vaxxers happened. The anti-vaxxers still spinning their inane, thoroughly debunked claims that vaccinations cause autism. They went to the Somali immigrant community, a community that is vulnerable and marginalized, and hosted a series of information workshops where they spewed their fantasies all over concerned parents with the predictable result. Vaccination rates among Somali immigrants were cut by more than half, while the rate among the general population stayed about the same, and we have the worst measles outbreak in Minnesota in decades, concentrated exactly in that vulnerable community. The anti-vaxxers should be ashamed of themselves, but of course they won't be. But there is one thing that the anti-vaxxers, which actually consist overwhelmingly of elite white liberals, one thing they do actually serve to prove is that paranoid fantasies and a refusal to accept scientific fact are not limited to the alt-right. All right, and speaking of fantasies and not accepting fact, here's a bit of good news, not good news for you. Good news! A recent Gallup poll reported that belief in creationism, the idea that God created humans in their present form about 10,000 years ago, is at its lowest point since Gallup began asking the question 35 years ago. Not good news. That lowest point still meant that 38% of those polled used creationism to describe their understanding of how we got here, and another 38% said, sure, evolution changed over a long time, but that process is being guided by God, which actually isn't evolution at all. Only 19% were prepared to go with scientific reality. Trying to end this on a more hopeful note, that 19% is nearly double the level it was from 15 years ago and has been rising. If slowly, it has been rising over time. All right, next up, one of our regular features. This is the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. And as always, there were plenty of nominees. For example, we had Ben Carson, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, heading up a department he himself said before his nomination that he was not qualified to lead, telling an interviewer that, quote, I think poverty to a large extent is also a state of mind. Then we had TheRump himself, the man himself. There was a Reuters report that his aides get him to read national security briefings by making sure his name is mentioned as often as possible. Then there was one Alex Gardega, who decided to make a supposedly artistic comment on the fearless girl statue that's facing the bull on Wall Street. He put a statue of a pug appearing to pee on the girl's leg. But our winner topped them all. So this week, the big red nose this week goes to Representative Tim Walberg. At a constituent town hall meeting on May 26th, Walberg asked a question about climate change. First gave the by now familiar dodge of, well, the climate's always changing, which actually it's not. Climate tends to be pretty stable for long periods of time. But he then added that he's not concerned about climate change because quoting, "I believe that there is a creator, God, who's much bigger than us, and I'm confident that if there's a real problem, he can take care of it." He then topped that off by saying that he won't take a backseat to anybody on good stewardship of the earth, and he proved it by recalling trout fishing in a stream. So, yuppers, don't worry about climate change. God will fix it. Just like God steps in at the last moment to head off every other catastrophe, plague, and extinction. Do I need to say it? Tim Walberg is a clown. All right, and now our other regular weekly feature. This is the outrage of the week. Felix Julian Motino is a Honduran national who entered the U.S. without papers in 2005. He is, in other words, an undocumented immigrant. In the years since, he has built a life here. He works as a house painter. He pays his taxes. He has a U.S.-born wife, Alexis, for the last 2 years. He has 2 U.S.-born children, aged 9 and 6, for whom he pays child support. Felix Motino, 31, wanted to come out of the shadows. He wanted to begin the process of gaining legal status. So he requested a meeting with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. On the day, he and his wife and his attorney went to the federal building in Cincinnati, Ohio, for the meeting. They showed the officials all their documents. The officials looked at all the documents. The officials approved the couple's marriage petition, and then the officials arrested Felix Motino and sent him for deportation. What is wrong with these people? Even when you have somebody who wants to do it right, who tries to do it right, who wants to make it right, he's still just another criminal in their eyes. Well, actually, yes, we do know what's wrong with them. They're being directed by an administration chock full of bigoted xenophobes. They don't care who they deport as long as they can eject foreigners, reject them, eject the other. It's been noted more than once that Barack Obama, that his administration actually deported more people than any previous administration, which is true. But in fairness to them and to that administration's credit, its focus was on deporting those with actual criminal records who actually had been convicted of a serious crime or who were regarded as a threat to that wonderfully vague phrase, national security. With TheRump, they don't care. They really don't. You're the other, so you're gone. They're so eager, so ready, so busy grabbing up anybody they can find, anybody they come across. You don't have to be convicted of a crime. You don't even have to be accused of a crime other than simply being here. They're so frothing at the mouth avid that they continue to dump more and more people into this icy system, even as that system and the related courts are already so overwhelmed with all the people they've already dumped in there that they're falling further and further behind, and they're actually losing track of people who are convicted of serious crimes. And then they have the gall to call all this enhancing public safety. They are without mercy, they are without compassion, they are without understanding, they are without humanity. They are an outrage. All right, we'll finish up with this. An experiment led by a guy named Kyle Drop of Morning Consult. Nearly 1,800 people were shown a blank map of Asia and asked to point out North Korea. Focus of enough of our media attention of late that people call it our biggest national threat, greater than terrorism, greater than anything. Over 20 different countries on that map got guesses. Only 36% got it right. Now, there were 2 things I found interesting in the results of all this. One was that respondents who could correctly identify North Korea, and if you still don't find it, here's a better look. The people who could correctly identify North Korea tended to view diplomatic and non-military strategies more favorably than those who couldn't. And the other was that those who could find North Korea were much more likely than those who couldn't to disagree with the notion that the United States should do nothing about North Korea. In other words, those who found who could find North Korea were less likely to favor military action, but more likely to say, we've got to do something. Now, related to that, again, related to North Korea, there is a law on the books in Washington state that prevents planning for a nuclear attack. It allows for evacuation for every kind of disaster scenario except a nuclear bomb. There is a move in the state legislature in Washington to change that because, North Korea, saying if it has a probability of happening, you should prepare for it. What's driving this sort of concern is statements like the one in the article that I quoted, which said that, again quoting the article, military experts say North Korea is about 3 years away from actually being able to hit the West Coast with a nuke. Now, I can't help but wonder, it'll be interesting to see if over the next couple of years, to see if North Korean ICBMs become like Iranian nuclear weapons. See, before the deal with Iran was made, recently, last year, Israel had been saying that Iran was 1 to 3 to 5 years away from getting a nuclear weapon, and had been saying that since 1992, which basically makes Iranian nuclear weapons at minimum 20 years overdue now. A while back, I said that the old riddle, what's always coming but never arrives, now has two answers. The classic answer of tomorrow and the more recent answer of Iranian nuclear weapons. It'll be interesting to see if over the next couple of years, if North Korean ICBMs become a third answer to that same question. All right, I do have time for this, so I'm going to stick it in right here at the end. It's Everything You Need to Know, which is one of our occasional features where you can learn a lot about something in a very short time. In this case, it's everything you need to know about how Donald TheRump views power in just 4 sentences. 1, he praised Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte for his unbelievable job on the drug problem, a job that consists largely of a bloody war that has killed 9,000 people so far. He has praised both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, calling each of them a good man. In Saudi Arabia, he praised the Saudis, religious fanatics who oppress women and enable terrorism. And in Europe, at the NATO conference, facing a room of freely elected leaders, he lectured, sniped at, and tried to bully them. And that is everything you need to know. All right, that's it. We're going to wrap up right there. We're going to come back. I got a couple of big things I want to talk about, but they're kind of in-depth things that take a little preparation, so hopefully I'll get to some of that next week. In the meantime, we will see you next week. For now, you just go on and you have the best week you possibly can. Enjoy June. It's here. And for now, as always, peace.